The land had always seemed ordinary to anyone passing by, a stretch of open fields bordered by tall oak trees that swayed gently in the wind. To strangers, it was just another piece of unused property, but to her, it was the heartbeat of her family's history. Her grandfather had once worked that soil with his bare hands, planting seeds and raising livestock, while her mother told stories under the shade of the oldest tree. Every inch of the property carried struggle, survival, and she guarded those memories like treasure. Neighbors often wondered why she never sold it, why she never built fancy houses or rented it out. She simply smiled and said, "Some things are worth more than money." And so, the land remained quiet, untouched, almost forgotten by the world around it. But the quietness wasn't weakness. It was patience. She had watched as nearby towns grew crowded, as developers turned farmland into parking lots, and as HOA boards popped up everywhere, claiming control over communities they didn't build. She knew one day someone would come for her land, because it was too big, too valuable, too tempting to greedy eyes. She didn't stop them from looking. She didn't argue when surveyors walked the edges with clipboards, or when developers whispered about opportunities. Instead, she let them think she was silent, that she didn't understand the game being played. In truth, she understood it better than they ever could. Her family had taught her long ago that power doesn't always come from fighting loud battles. Sometimes, it comes from waiting for the right moment to strike. And so, when the HOA began making plans to build a massive neighborhood on what they assumed was abandoned land, she said nothing. Trucks rolled in, concrete was poured, and one by one, homes began to rise from the soil that her family had once walked barefoot on. People saw a woman staying quiet, but in reality, she was watching every detail, every brick, every mistake. She had something the HOA had overlooked. Something more valuable than all their shiny contracts and polished speeches. She had the original deed, signed and sealed, a weapon stronger than any bulldozer. And while the world thought she was powerless, she was already preparing the trap that would change everything. The HOA believed they were untouchable, a group of men in suits who thought their money and lawyers gave them power over everyone else, with glossy brochures showing smiling families and kids playing in perfect yards. They sold the dream of a community that didn't exist yet. 96 families signed their names, each convinced they were investing in a safe future, each trusting that the HOA truly owned the land. No one asked questions because the paperwork looked official. The sales pitch sounded confident, and the HOA had a reputation for getting projects done fast. The bulldozers came, the foundations were poured, and within months, houses lined the streets where wildflowers once grew. To the buyers, it was exciting brand new homes, a fresh start, neighbors moving in together like pieces of a puzzle. But beneath the surface, everything rested on a lie. The HOA never checked the land records carefully, never noticed that the property still belonged to her, tied to her family name for generations. They brushed past the warning signs, convinced their contracts and their money could make problems disappear. Yet while they celebrated each house sold, she was watching, in silence, her heart steady and her mind sharp. She kept the deed locked away, a piece of paper older than any of their legal tricks, proof that the earth beneath those homes was hers by right. It didn't matter how many families moved in or how much money changed hands. The truth was unshakable. Every brick they laid, every roof they raised, only dug them deeper into the trap she had set, without saying a word. The homeowners didn't know. The builders didn't know. Even the bankers didn't know. The truth would come crashing down. The HOA thought she was invisible, that her silence meant defeat. But she had learned long ago that silence could be the strongest weapon of all. And when the moment was right, when the 96 homes stood tall, and every last dollar had been spent, she would step forward with her evidence. That was when they would finally see who really owned the land they stood on, and how badly they had underestimated her. The neighborhood was finally complete. 96 houses standing in neat rows like soldiers, each one filled with families who believed they had built their forever home. The HOA celebrated with ribbon-cutting ceremonies, speeches about community pride, and promises of a bright future. But while the new residents were busy planting flowers in their yards and painting their front doors, she was preparing her strike. For months she had remained silent, letting them build higher and higher, letting them invest every dollar, every ounce of trust, into something that was never truly theirs. Then, with calm precision, she gathered her documents, the original deed, the old signatures, the undeniable proof of ownership, hand-filed her case in court. The paperwork moved quickly, and within weeks, the HOA leaders who once boasted of their success were being summoned before a judge. At first, they laughed it off, telling the families not to worry, claiming it was a misunderstanding that would be cleared in a matter of days. But the more the judge examined the evidence, the less their confidence mattered. Every survey, every record, every historical document pointed to her as the rightful owner. Their contracts and brochures meant nothing against the ink of history that had preserved her claim for generations. What they thought was just an abandoned lot had turned into a legal battlefield, and she had the high ground. The HOA scrambled, their lawyers flipping through binders and searching for loopholes, but the walls were already closing in. For the families living in those houses, panic began to grow as whispers spread. What if they had bought homes that weren't legally theirs? What if their hard-earned savings had been poured into stolen soil? And through it all, she remained steady, her voice calm, her presence unshaken. The trap she had laid long ago had finally sprung shut, and every nail hammered into those houses now stood as evidence against the people who had tried to erase her from her own land. The HOA had walked straight into her plan, blind to the power of patience, blind to the strength of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. Now the tables had turned, and she was no longer just the quiet landowner they ignored, was the force that would bring their empire crashing down. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed so tightly that people stood along the walls, whispering anxiously about what was about to happen. The 96 homeowners sat together, fear written on their faces, while the HOA board members tried to look calm, though their eyes betrayed their unease. At the front, she sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her presence steady and strong. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, and within minutes the truth was laid bare. Document after document was presented, each one showing her family's rightful ownership of the land. The judge's voice was calm but firm as he read the evidence aloud, leaving no room for doubt. The HOA lawyers tried to object, their words growing more desperate, but the weight of the truth crushed every argument they made. Finally, the ruling came like thunder. The land belonged to her, and every house built on it now fell under her legal control. Gasps filled the room as the words sank in. The families who thought they owned their dream homes sat frozen, some covering their mouths in disbelief, others looking angrily at the HOA who had sold them lies. The board members, once so proud and untouchable, slumped in their seats, their empire collapsing before their eyes. Even the judge paused to remind everyone that ignorance of ownership did not erase the law. What was hers remained hers, no matter how many millions the HOA had poured into their project. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of homeowners whispering in panic about what would happen to them now. She did not gloat, she did not smile. She simply nodded, as if the earth itself had spoken the justice she always knew would come. For years, they had dismissed her as powerless, but now the truth stood in the open for all to see. The HOA had been humiliated, the families deceived, and the court had confirmed what she had always known. The land was hers, and nothing, not lies, not money, not false contracts, could ever change that. When the gavel struck and the ruling was sealed, she rose from her seat with quiet dignity, her presence commanding more respect than any loud celebration ever could. The reporters rushed forward, their cameras flashing, desperate to capture the face of the woman who had just brought down an entire HOA empire. But she did not stop for attention, nor did she linger for applause. She walked out of the courthouse, as if she had simply finished what needed to be done, her steps steady and unshaken. Behind her, chaos erupted. Homeowners demanded answers. Lawyers scrambled to explain, and the once powerful board members avoided every eye in the room, their arrogance shattered. On the courthouse steps, people whispered her name with a mix of awe and disbelief. Some called her ruthless, others called her brilliant, but she knew the truth. She had only defended what was rightfully hers. For too long, others had believed they could take her land, erase her history, and profit from her silence. But now, 96 houses stood as monuments to their greed and to her patience. She didn't have to tear down walls or shout in anger. The law itself had spoken for her, and in the end, it was justice that rang louder than any protests. That night, she returned to her land, the same soil her grandfather had tilled, the same fields her family had walked barefoot upon, and stood at its center beneath the stars. The neighborhood lights now glowed across what was still hers, and the air carried the weight of victory. She breathed deeply, not of revenge, but of peace, knowing that her family's legacy was safe, secured by her strength and perseverance. The HOA had thought they were building a community for themselves, but in truth, they had only built evidence of their own downfall. The homeowners would have to face the reality of what they had bought into, but none of it was her burden to carry. Her duty was to her family, to her ancestors, and to the land that had always been hers. And as she stood there, with the night quiet around her, one truth became clear: you cannot steal what does not belong to you. And you should never underestimate the power of a woman who refuses to be erased. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, make sure to share this video with friends and family, and subscribe to the Silent Side USA for more powerful stories.